Well, I want to welcome all of you. I apologize for the inconvenience that you had in coming down here, but they're working on the roof and making a lot of noise in our Stampfer chapel. So I'm glad you came. Thank you. But it's not being streamed, but it is being recorded. First of all, I want to express my appreciation to Christine Hayes. If it weren't for her, I would never have chosen the topic that we have for today. In my own mind, I never really put together the books of Ezra and Nehemiah with the book of Ruth. I would have had this class purely on Ezra and Nehemiah. But she really opened up my eyes to the importance of having in our discussion today the book of Ruth. They probably lived at about the same time, but that's not why we're discussing them together. The major topic of our discussion today is not so much Ezra and Nehemiah and Ruth, but the whole question of our relationship to non-Jews and our willingness to be open and receptive to non-Jews. The difference between Ezra and Nehemiah and Ruth is very vivid even today, and we're going to be talking about that. Now, the reason why we're discussing Ezra and Nehemiah is quite obvious. Our course on the Bible has been based on the Bible as reflecting history, reflecting the history of mankind. We start with the book of Bereshit. When the world was created, mankind was created, Adam and Eve. And then historically, we have read in the Bible the subsequent history of the emergence of the Jewish people, beginning with Abraham, and then we went into the Exodus, came to the land of Israel. We talked about the whole history of Israel, the kings and the prophets in Israel. And then we came to the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylonia and expulsion temporarily from Israel for 70 years to Babylonia. And then we had the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi after the return. And then we come to the most remarkable event, which was the declaration of Cyrus. Just think, between the time of the declaration of Cyrus, which took place at about the year 500 BCE, the next time in Jewish history that there ever emerged a similar document was 1917 CE. About 2,500 years had passed. In between, nothing like this ever happened. So, I'm just going to read. It's very short. From the second book of Chronicles, chapter 36, verse 23. If you want to follow it in your own Bibles, you can. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, "The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. Any one of you, of all his people, the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up." That's about 6 sentences shorter than the Balfour Declaration. But it says a lot more. The Balfour Declaration, which is not in the Bible, reads, "His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine." And then it goes on, respecting the rights of all who are living there. In other words, what Cyrus promised was that God had charged him, Cyrus, with building a temple in Jerusalem. He's not only allowing the Jews to return, but that he will build for them a temple. Well, as we read in Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi, the first part of his proclamation happened, and Jews went back to Jerusalem. Not the majority of Jews. The majority of Jews basically said to Cyrus, "Thanks, but no thanks. We welcome the opportunity of going, but we like it here. They had a good life and preferred to remain there, and you can't blame them. The prospects of moving back to Judea were not attractive. And when they got back, sure enough, they started building a temple, started settling back in Jerusalem, and it was a very difficult condition for them. No doubt in my mind that many of them said to themselves, this is not for us. There are no figures involved that I know of, but I'm sure that many of them returned back to Babylonia. We are so proud of the Chalutzim that came to settle in Palestine. In the very early days, even before the Zionist movement. And we read the accounts of their life in Israel. Miserable life. Building kibbutzim. Malaria. Terribly hard work. Hunger. Now, I'm going to mention a name, for example, that's familiar to all of you. And I do so with some apology. But it's typical of what happened. One of the big major leaders in the Jewish community when I came to Portland was Jack Olds. How many of you are familiar with the Olds family and Jack Olds' name? A lot of you are. His grandson is still my accountant. Jack Olds' father name was Alter Olds, whom I knew when I came. When I met him, I learned how he got the name Alter. He did not receive that name at the bris. I don't even know what his name was then. How did he get the name of Alter? You know what Alter means? Old. It didn't come from the name Olds. That itself was, Ellis Island did that. Anyway, he became a chalutz. Fell ill to malaria, was on the verge of death. And one of the things the Jewish families did in such a time was to change the name of the baby, so that when the angel of death comes knocking at the door, he'll be knocking and saying, "Where is Olds?" Using his first name. And he's not here anymore. they changed his name to Alter, indicating he should live to be an old man. Well, he gave up, came to America, settled here in Portland, joined by thousands of others. And we cannot in any way sit in judgment on anybody who does that, unless you put yourself in their shoes. What would you do under those circumstances? So, it was very hard. It was hard for the people in the time of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And they were on the verge of giving up. They really were. That would have been the end. Just like the northern kingdom of Israel. They were driven out of Israel by the Assyrians and disappeared. The same would have happened had not Jews in Babylonia, in Persia, who had conquered Babylonia, had they not bestirred themselves and decided to do something. They did something very clever. They opened up a commission of inquiry to re-examine the archives of Cyrus. And lo and behold, they found in the archives these words which I just read. Cyrus had promised to build a temple in Jerusalem. And the Persian government had reneged on that promise. So they turned to the government and they said, "You're obliged to build us the temple. You, the Persian government, pledged to do it. Now do it." There were very high officials in the government of Persia. Among them Nehemiah, the cupbearer, the equivalent of Secretary of State. And sure enough, they honored that pledge. Not only they honored it, they appointed Nehemiah and Ezra to represent the Persian government in performing the task of rebuilding Judea, Jerusalem, and the temple. And most important of all, providing the cash. So Ezra and Nehemiah were sent officially by the government to represent this greatest empire in the world, to do this job. And the job was done. A new temple was built. something that Haggai and so on prayed for, but what they did. Again, we don't have details. My guess is they had contractors from Persia to come to Jerusalem to build the temple. They provided the impetus to complete this undertaking. Now, fortunately, when you've got the government behind you and you've got the funds, it doesn't take that long to build a temple. So we find in the book of Ezra a description of the final construction of the temple. Look at chapter 3 of Ezra. This is the celebration of the building of the temple. When the builders had laid the foundations of the temple, priests in their vestments with trumpets and Levites with cymbals were stationed to give praise to the Lord, as King David of Israel had ordained. They sang songs extolling and praising the Lord. And then it goes on, many of the priests and Levites and chiefs, the old men who had seen the first house, wept loudly at the sight of the founding of this house. Many others shouted joyously at the top of their voices. Picture this. 70 years had passed. There were people there who were older than 70 years. That can happen. And they remembered the original temple that King Solomon had built. And they saw this temple. When they saw the new temple, they cried. It was so sad looking compared to the old one. But the overwhelming majority were younger, who had never seen the older one. They laughed and shouted in great joy. What a wonderful picture of that scene. It even says in verse 13, the people could not distinguish the shouts of joy from the people's weeping, for the people raised a great shout, the sound of which could be heard from afar. That's a wild exaggeration, in my opinion. I'm thinking of people who have been living, who are over 70 years old, who are crying. They could not have been more than, at the most, 10% compared to the younger ones who were shouting with joy. But even writers of the Bible are entitled to some exaggeration. Now, we look at chapter 7 of the book of Ezra. This is the charge by the king to Ezra. Let me make it clear now. Nehemiah was appointed by the king to physically restore Jerusalem, which means, number one, he would build a wall around Jerusalem. No self-respecting city in the ancient world could live without a wall for security. What's true in the ancient world is not necessarily true in the modern world. But that's what he did. And the fact of the matter is, any one of you, I don't know, I know there's a large delegation from Portland going to Israel next year, but I was there. You can still go and see actually the remains of the wall that Nehemiah built. You can see it there. He built a great wall around the city to give it security. He built a temple in the city. And Nehemiah was in charge of all of that. Now, here's the charge to Ezra in chapter 7 of Ezra. You are commissioned by the king and his advisors to regulate Judah and Jerusalem according to the law of your God, which is in your care. In other words, Ezra, you are in charge of the community. You establish the law. Run the city. And you, Ezra, by the divine wisdom you possess, appoint magistrates and judges to judge all the people in the province beyond the river that's in Palestine, who know the law of your God and teach those who do not know them. In other words, there is a constitution. You're in charge. What was the Constitution? The answer is the Torah. The Torah became the constitution of the land of Israel. And you are the president. And appoint judges to rule the land according to the law. Now, Ezra has an enormous responsibility. First of all, he had to put the law together. It's assumed, when we talked about the Bible, Remember we talked at the J document, the E document, the P document, the D document. Remember we started with that. Somebody had to put all those documents together to make up the Torah as we know it. That was the undertaking of Ezra. And what he did further was to introduce a custom that we still follow today. Every Shabbat, whether you are present at services or not, every Shabbat, the Torah is read. So that in the course of the year, we read the entire Torah. That was the idea of Ezra. Everybody has to learn the Torah. What's so interesting is that he even states that not only are you supposed to read the Torah, but you're supposed to translate it and interpret it and explain it. In other words, when you come to the synagogue here today on Shabbat, on one side you have the Hebrew Torah, on the other side the English translation. Basically, it was Ezra who said, people have to be provided with the translation of the Torah as you read it. Because after being in Babylonia for so many years, apparently the majority of Jews no longer understood Hebrew. What language did they speak? Aramaic. In the traditional Chumash, to this day, you have the Hebrew Bible and the translation in Aramaic. Aramaic would not do us any more good than Hebrew in Portland, Oregon. So we use English. But the principle is the same. The whole idea of a sermon was included by Ezra. Originally, the sermon was based on the Torah. Every traditional sermon began with a text. And then you start with the text and talk about anything you want to talk about. And sometimes even something that the congregation wants to hear. But again, that was Ezra. So Jewish life to this day is so much based on what he introduced in his time. Now I want to come to the part that the book of Ruth has to play. I'm not going to start with Ruth, but I'm going to start with Ezra. Ezra in chapter 9 now turns the topic. in his own way. Mind you, his primary purpose is to preserve Judaism. He knew what happened to the northern kingdom. He knew the threat of assimilation. He knew that the Jews were a small minority and could disappear by assimilation into the large majority. So he took steps to try to prevent that from happening. That's what we've been talking about. He took physical steps like what Nehemiah did, because they worked together to protect Jews physically by the wall, by the temple. You had to have a building in which you preserve Judaism. And Ezra follows up by preserving Judaism through learning the Torah. We read the Torah, we learn what God wants in the Torah, and in that way preserve Judaism. What's the big problem? Well, for Ezra, and for many, many years in Jewish history, the big problem was intermarriage. Now, I personally have been a rabbi now, or just about now, for 70 years. I vividly recall during the course of these 70 years how much attention was paid in Jewish life to the rate of intermarriage. And it was dealt with almost as though we were counting the length of life of Judaism. If the rate of intermarriage went beyond 50%, everything looked very gloomy. If you look at the rate of intermarriage in Europe today, it's way below 50%. It's probably below 25%. And we have traced very carefully the rate of intermarriage in America. I used to see figures practically every year. And so we built institutions to struggle against it. And that's still a great deal of the impetus for Jewish life. Provide education, provide experiences. In these days, provide an Israel experience. All of that is designed in order to raise the odds of Jewish survival. Relatively little attention has been paid to the rate of conversion to Judaism by non-Jews. And that's too bad. I rarely see actual figures, say in this country, of that rate. All I do know, and somebody here in the class that knows it very well, is that how remarkably large the Introduction to Judaism class is to welcome non-Jews in the study of Judaism with the view of their adopting Judaism as knowledgeable Jews. But that is happening also. But Ezra did not have a clue to that approach. What he assumed was that intermarriage is the equivalent of abandonment of Judaism. Now, it's one thing for a rabbi to get up and give a sermon about intermarriage. There's a very famous story about a rabbi who came, a new rabbi to the community, and the first sermon he gave was about keeping kosher. And the president tells him, Rabbi, over 90% of the congregation doesn't keep kosher, and you're offending them by talking about that. We want to be a friendly congregation. So, okay. So the next Friday night, he talked about intermarriage. And the president said, Rabbi, it's getting worse. A high proportion of the congregation is intermarried. Don't talk about that. So the rabbi said, well, what should I talk about? Talk about Judaism. That's one thing. But when you're an Ezra and you're appointed by the government to be in charge of the government of Israel, that's something else entirely. I have to confess, thank God I was never an Ezra. I wouldn't want that responsibility. I'd rather be a rabbi and not have the congregation listen to me than to impose Judaism upon them by law. You know what he did? He abrogated all intermarriages. Like that. You can do it if you're a dictator. And he did. He banned intermarriage. Here's what he said in chapter 9, starting with verse 7. From the time of our fathers to this very day, we have been deep in guilt. Because of our iniquities, we, our kings, our priests, have been handed over to foreign kings, to the sword, to captivity, to pillage, to humiliation. But now, for a short while, there has been a reprieve from the Lord our God, who has granted us a surviving remnant and given us a stake in his holy place. Our God has restored the luster to our eyes and furnished us with a little sustenance for our in our bondage. In other words, We've been exiled to Babylonia. We've been punished for our sins. And now, thank God, Cyrus has returned us and given us the land of Israel and the temple. Now, what can we say in the face of this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you gave us through your servants, the prophets. You said the land that you are about to possess is a land unclean through the uncleanness of the peoples of the land, through their abhorrent practices with which they in their iniquities have filled from one end to the other. Now, what does that mean? Now we got to remember, when Israel conquered the land of Israel under Joshua, what were they told by Joshua? Kill or drive out all the inhabitants of this land. Read it. That's what the Bible says. I'm not proud to say it. Because we are coming into the land and we are pure. We are God's people. And any contact with non-God's people is bringing impurity into our lives. This was the attitude. You know, that attitude still carries on to this day in one way. You know what kosher wine is? How is kosher wine different from non-kosher wine? What's the difference? You know what it is? When kosher wine is made, no non-Jew is allowed to handle the grape juice and the wine until it's sealed. That's all. Wine which is used religiously, Jewishly, should be made only by Jews. You know how we get around it today? Very simply. Nobody touches the wine today. It's all done automatically by pipes. That's a fact. But here's what he says. Moses and Joshua, of course, commanded all non-Jews are impure. And then in verse 12, now then, do not give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor let their daughters marry your sons. Do nothing for their well-being or advantage. Then you will be strong and enjoy the bounty of the land and bequeath it to your children forever. Wow. How liberal can you get? You know, I still remember all kinds of stories. Jews who grew up in Europe, old Jews, tell me that it was their practice, if they were walking down the street and came to a church, they'd cross the street and walk on the other side of the street until they passed the church, then go back to the street they were walking on. They said that was normal. And I can tell you from my experience, this was still when I was in the synagogue on 13th and Market. There was then the rabbi, fortunately I can't remember his name, from Shari Torah, who came to see me in my office at the synagogue about something in the community. Then he said to me, "Could I come in your sanctuary?" I said, "Sure." He walked into the sanctuary, sat down on the first available seat, and then he turned to me and he says, "You know, this is the first time in my life that I've ever sat down in a conservative shul," as though he was confessing to some terrible sin. So I asked him, "How did it feel?" And he walked out under his own energies. But that was an attitude that prevailed of total separateness. Now, let me talk about a little bit. We don't have much time. I'll probably finish this up next week. About the book of Ruth. Written probably about the same time. It tells the story of a Jewish woman named Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, were living in Bethlehem in Israel, near Jerusalem. And there was a drought. And the book of Ruth tells us that her husband and Naomi, his wife, and their 2 children decided to move to, of all places, Moab, adjacent to Israel. Now, it's obvious when they decided to move to Moab, very few, if any, other residents of Bethlehem moved to Moab with them. Of all the countries neighboring Israel, only 2 are specifically mentioned in the Bible: Moab and Edom. That Jews are not allowed to marry any Moabite or Edomite. Why? Because when the original Israelites were coming from Egypt to the land of Israel, on the other side of by the way of the other side of the Jordan, they were mistreated by Moab and Edom and told that they can't go through their country peacefully. And Moab has a long history of war with Israel. So why did they go to Moab? Well, put yourself in their position. They feel they have to move. Life is tough for them. People move. People move all the time. Why did they do that? The answer, obviously, they didn't care. They weren't religious. There was good grazing land in Moab. They'll go to Moab. And sure enough, they went to Moab. And sure enough, their two sons met two young Moabite women. There weren't any other kinds of women. There was no Jewish community center in Moab. So they got married, presumably happily married. Well, finally, the climatic conditions changed. The drought was over. Elimelech died in Moab. And Naomi was there by herself. She had daughters-in-law. Presumably all was well, but she longed for her family. Her husband was dead. Her children were married. So she decided to return home. Very understandable. And her daughters-in-law decide to go with her. Lovely. Until they got to the border. When they got to the border, it was a point of no return. Once you go across the border, you made a decision, like crossing the Rubicon in Roman history. Her daughter Orpah realized that she was losing her family, and she decides to remain with her family and takes leave of Naomi. And then we have this famous passage of Ruth. Ruth said, verse 16, "Do not urge me to leave you, to turn back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. Thus and more may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you. Those are very famous lines. Basically, and this is my point, with that statement, she became Jewish. Period. No rabbi, no mikveh, no nothing. No introduction to Judaism class, right. Your God will be my God. And there will where you'll be buried, I'll be buried. That's what it took basically to become a Jew. And readily accepted. I don't have time to go into this more today, but we'll take up the end of Ruth next time. We're also going to take up next time the book of Proverbs, and hopefully the book of Ecclesiastes. Our time is getting short, so. But anyway, the wonderful thing about all of this, and that's why I wanted to quote from Christine Hayes, there are to this day very, very different attitudes that Jews have to non-Jews. We're in the process of making more and more advances to welcome Jews into our community, to have interfaith services, to do all kinds of things together. And at the same time, we have an equally, and if not more so, rise in ultra-Orthodoxy that rejects any kind of contact with non-Jews. Here they are reflected in two books of the Bible that arose at about the same time. So I just want to emphasize profound differences within Judaism have always been our situation. And probably will always be, who knows. Okay, thank you.